Next up at number 5 we have Diana's Tree by Alejandra Pizarnik, translated by Yvette Siegert. We're going to be comparing this to Tender Buttons, the final studio album by the band Broadcast. Now, from the very intense Wikipedia research that I performed, it seems that Diana's Tree was sort of Pizarnik's breakthrough work into the Spanish-speaking world's literary consciousness. Originally published in 1962 when the author was just 26 years old, this extremely concise 38-poem cycle came branded with the literary establishment's seal of approval in the form of an introduction by Octavio Paz, a Mexican writer who would later go on to win the Nobel Prize. And over time, Paz was not alone among the heavyweights of the Spanish-speaking literary world to be heaping Pizarnik with praise. Modern literary darlings such as Julio Cortázar and Roberto Bolaño have both called out Pizarnik as among the greatest poets of our era. By contrast, you couldn't really say that Tender Buttons by Broadcast made quite the same sizable critical splash when it was first released in 2005. Building on the band's penchant for swirling 60s psychedelic pop and their general affinity for slightly creepy, synth-driven ambient music, Tender Buttons comes off, at least in my mind, as the band's most aesthetically cohesive album. The title being a direct reference to the experimental poetry of Gertrude Stein. There's a more regimented quality as these tracks transition one into another, most of which are characterized by some surprisingly harsh, distorted electronic melodies, and this repetitive, almost chant-like vocal delivery by the band's lead singer Trish Keenan. And it's the use of language in these two works that really stood out to me as their strongest connection. Pizarnik is known throughout the translation community not only for being a big name, whose famous works you definitely don't want to fuck up when you're trying to convey them in English, but also for her minimalist, almost mystical use of repeated images and phrases, what some of her translators have referred to as talismanic language. These gigantic, almost elemental symbols pop up again and again throughout her poetry. Things like sleep, death, the night, mirrors, the wind, emerge and dissipate throughout her verse, accumulating subtle new connotations as we glimpse yet another of their seemingly infinite aspects. This obsession with the raw power of language and the sort of alchemical transformations that can take place as seemingly mundane phrases are repeated again and again is used to incredible effect throughout the title track, Tender Buttons. The coal light, the colors, the caress, the comb, the calm, the colors, the cortex. But whereas this effect feels immediately gratifying when it's delivered in the form of a 3-minute pop song, there's a tragically unfulfilled quality to Pizarnik's poetry. Despite Pizarnik's lifelong devotion to the craft of poetry, the speaker in these poems seems to be constantly calling to our attention language's ultimate, unavoidable failure to convey the artistic self at the core of these works. Here's a few sample stanzas to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. I miss forgetting the hour of my birth. I miss no longer playing the role of recent arrival. You have built your house, you have feathered your birds, you have beaten against the wind with your own bones. You have finished on your own what no one ever started. Days when a distant word takes hold of me, I go through those days sleepwalking and transparent. The beautiful wind-up doll sings to herself, charms herself, tells herself stuff and stories. A nest made of stiff thread where I dance and lament myself. At my countless funerals, she is her own blazing mirror, her spare for the cold bonfires, her mystical element, her adultery with the names that crop up alone on pallid evenings. Like a poem that's aware of the silence of things, you speak so as not to see me. And while it's not surprising to me that her fellow writers would so deeply identify with this maddening but endlessly alluring process of trying to craft just the right vessel for one's thoughts and identity, as a reader I was left feeling impressed but somewhat alienated, almost like I was watching a theatrical performance through thick layers of bulletproof glass. The overall aesthetic effect isn't diminished, but as a spectator I felt constantly aware of my remove from all of the action going on stage. The final point I'll raise in linking these two works together is that it's very hard to separate the process of interpreting them as works of art from the lives of their creators, both of which were tragically cut short. Pizarnik committed suicide at age 36, apparently something she'd been contemplating for more than a decade as she struggled with issues of mental health. Similarly, Tender Buttons was, sadly and quite unexpectedly, Broadcast's last studio album, as the lead singer Trish Keenan passed away from a bout of pneumonia, of all things, at age 42. This notion of an artist cut off in their prime seems to fascinate fans and critics alike, who in the wake of an artist's passing are prone to obsessively poring over their works, trying to dissect how their craft might have continued to develop in new and unexpected ways. As for me, I'd rather just be grateful for the works that we are lucky enough to have, and try to just enjoy them for what they are, whatever that means.